Alright, hello everybody. This is going to be the last video in our Reconstruction Era series of U.S. history. We're going to talk about the end of the Reconstruction period, and this starts with the election of Ulysses S Grant, right? He's not responsible for the end of Reconstruction, but it's during his presidency that we're going to see a lot of changes. We're going to see some political scandals, and we're also going to see the death of a lot of the radical Republicans. And as the former Confederate states are reconstructed, the Democratic Party is also going to gain strength. So here's the Ulysses S. Grant ticket, and then the Seymour ticket for the Democratic Party. Now, waving the bloody shirt. Okay, so this is a term that's associated with, I don't know, sort of rubbing in the aftermath of the Civil War itself, right? So so the actual political strategy of this election, at least in the waving the bloody shirt reference, was to sort of keep referring to all the martyrs of the Civil War, the heroes, and that was a way to criticize any political opponent, right? And so they were saying, well, you have to vote for Grant because he's a war hero, and that's what waving the bloody shirt means. Here's the electoral and popular vote results of the election. So, as you can see, the Electoral College makes it look like there was a much larger victory for Grant, but there was a Democratic comeback overall in terms of the popular vote. Alright, just some images of Grant and a copy of his war memoirs. Alright, so as I was saying before, Grant's administration is not without scandal. Grant himself was not fingered for a scandal, but many people that were associated with him were. So, what's interesting before we get into the scandals, actually, let's just talk about Grant himself. He was supportive of Reconstruction. His first inaugural ball was actually racially integrated, and this was a first. His presidency overall was seen as very progressive. He said that he wanted to study the proper treatment of Native Americans. We will move on with talking about what's happening in the West in our next video series, and so it's important to realize that he had that standpoint. And he also elected several not elected, rather, he appointed several non politicians to his cabinet. So he was trying to arguably bring in Washington outsiders to, because as we know, even in modern politics, that's often something people want, right? They don't want someone who's been in Washington too long and has, for lack of a better phrase, drunk the Kool-Aid, right? And he did also avoid appointing really radical Republicans to his cabinet because he didn't want to alienate the Democrats. So the scandals. All right. So one of the first ones was the Credit Mobilier scandal of 1868. So a railroad company ended up bribing many members of Congress. That was the background behind this scandal. And again, it did not directly involve Grant, but because congressional members were accepting bribes, what this led to was a general distrust in Washington and the federal government, and of course that all leads back to the president, so it doesn't make Grant look good. And then there's the whiskey ring, which was a scandal that involved the diversion of tax dollars, and this conspiracy involved the complacency of politicians, of businessmen like whiskey distillers and whiskey distributors. So essentially, many politicians were actually using tax dollars actually to invest in the whiskey industry. And many of the politicians involved were Republicans. In fact, most of them were. And so again, that makes Grant look really bad. But so you're seeing not nearly as much as you see, of course, in the 20th century with Vietnam and Nixon and some of those topics. But you are going to see that in the wake of the Civil War, especially as Reconstruction is continuing, people aren't really trusting what's happening in the federal government. In particular, people who do not support the president or the Republican Party. The Indian Ring is the final scandal that is, at least is on this slide, the most famous. So this involves Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap. He accepted bribes from companies with licenses to trade on Indian reservations. And Grant appointed William Belknap to be the Secretary of War. And so in some ways, people can point directly to Grant for this, right? Because they say, well, you hired this guy, so therefore it's your fault. So none of these make him look good. Oh, we're not even finished with scandals, but these are not necessarily as directly relevant to Grant himself. Okay, so this is the beginning. We're going to get much more into this with the Progressive Era, but this is the beginning of some of the other forms of political corruption that we see in the form of machine and boss politics. We'll talk about those later, but the Tweed Ring involved William Marcy Tweed, who was the notorious head of Tammany Hall, which is a political machine. A political machine. Let me just really briefly explain. I'll get to that in the Progressive Era much more, but a machine. This cartoon sort of exhibits it best, right? The idea behind a political machine is that the vote itself is used as a tool to win over a group of people, and arguably also to exploit them. So immigrants is a good example of this. Okay, so what this is, it says, this cartoon says the ballot is ballot in counting there is strength. All right, and so if you were a party boss or affiliated with a political party, you might try to persuade a group of vulnerable people or poor people, right, to vote for your party and promise them certain things in return, even if you don't follow through with that promise. The result of that is that people will vote for the candidate that you tell them to, even if they end up not actually getting much in return. In a lot of ways, this is sort of like political bribery. And so the Tweed Ring is one of the earliest examples of that. The Tammany Hall was a Democratic political party machine, and it plays a major role in New York City and New York State politics in the late 19th century. So we'll get back to Tammany Hall, just a little preview there. And Thomas Nast is a political cartoonist. We've actually looked at some of his cartoons already, and he plays a major role in pointing out some of these scandals. And so the era of political cartoons has already begun, but it's going to take a new form in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. All right, 1872, Grant's re-election. So you can see the electoral vote swings more in favor of him, and also he's a pretty popular president, so he earns more of the popular vote in this election as well. There we see the popular vote for the president. Now, what's interesting is you're seeing in some of the areas in the more rural parts of the South are much greater supporters of the Democratic challenger. So Grant wins, but in the areas that oppose Reconstruction, he's not winning by very much. The Panic of 1873. Okay, so economic problems a lot of times lead to the end of certain progressive political policies, and the Panic of 1873 is no exception. All right, so what happens to people when their money is at stake? Right? Are they going to try to continue to fight for progressive legislation that might not benefit them directly, or are they going to change course? This is sort of the ultimate question. So this is not a depression, but this is a financial recession. Some people might call it a depression, but I'm not an economist, so I can't speak to that. It lasts for a while, right? It lasts until 1879. And the causes of it were post-war inflation. We know that the federal government itself oftentimes turned to just printing more currency to raise money for the war. And of course, that's going to have tremendous blowback. Also, there was a trade deficit, right? Partially because of all the destruction and damage as a result of the war. The U.S. wasn't able to export as much as it did before the war, and it has to rebuild its economy, and that's going to lead to problems with trade. Also, land speculation is running out of control. We haven't talked a lot about that. We did allude to it when we discussed the species circular during the days of Jackson, but that was a while ago. So land speculation is essentially purchasing property, oftentimes, again, just plots of land, in the anticipation that the price will increase and then they will be sold back for a profit. And so oftentimes people who were associated with banks, people that had money to spend, would get in over their heads in land speculation by borrowing too much money. And if the market starts to take a tumble, then oftentimes they cannot pay back these loans. And if a bank issues too many loans, then it will also find itself in trouble. And that's ultimately what led to the Panic of 1873. In 1875, there is a congressional act called the Specie Redemption Act. Specie refers to hard currency like gold and silver. But with the Specie Redemption Act, what it called for was to redeem, or therefore return, paper currency and instead use specie, so use gold and silver to buy things, in particular to pay for land speculation. But the problem was that there were too many loans in paper currency anyway, and that's just going to lead to more of a financial panic because banks are going to get nervous and they're going to try to recall loans faster. And with land speculators buying too much, they can't pay back all their loans immediately. So many banks just fail altogether, close their doors, and then people who aren't even involved in the land speculation game are going to lose money. Oftentimes they will face a foreclosure of their mortgage. Farmers suffer tremendously as a result of the Panic of 1873. And so you can assume also that some of the people who were victimized by the Civil War, right, the oftentimes poor white farmers even, they're going to be increasingly experiencing hardships as a result of this. And so they're going to express their frustration through their votes. Okay, so in 1876, you see a little tiny minority party called the Greenback Party. It forms, makes small gains in congressional races, and what they want is the maintenance of paper currency, hence the term greenback. And they're bitterly opposed to the the Specie Resumption Act, and that's really important for us to realize because that shows us how unpopular the Specie Resumption Act was. Okay, the Supreme Court is going to sort of bite back and challenge some of the Reconstruction amendments. I don't know if I want to go into detail. No, I'm just going to talk about these cases super briefly in case you're taking a push and you need to get into detail. All right, so first, the Slaughterhouse case of 1873. Okay, so in this, the court offers a very narrow definition of the 14th Amendment. What it does is it distinguishes between the national citizenship and state citizenship. So the court argues that just because you're a citizen of the United States does not necessarily protect all the citizenship rights of one's state. So that, in many ways, allows the stripping of voting rights from freedmen. It gave states the primary authority over citizens' rights, not the federal government. So therefore, the Supreme Court weakened the 14th Amendment. Then you have Bradwell versus Illinois in the same year. So Myra Bradwell was a female attorney, and she was denied the right to practice law in the state of Illinois. And she argued that the 14th Amendment protected her as a female, too. And she said that the 14th Amendment so she argued that in the 14th Amendment, it said that the state had that according to the 14th Amendment, the state had unconstitutionally abridged the privileges and immunities clause that is guaranteed to citizens. But the Supreme Court rejects Bradwell's claim. It says that women are supposed to have a traditional role in the home. So again, they basically say here that the 14th Amendment does not apply to women, especially if they're doing a man's job, like being a lawyer. It's not a man's job. I'm joking. I'm laughing. You can't see my face, but you get the idea. Then U.S. versus Reese et alia in 1876. What this does is the court restricted congressional power to enforce the KKK Act. Okay, so this is problematic because, of course, over time, this is going to lead to more of a resurgence of not just the KKK, but it allows the black codes to continue, and of course it's also going to usher in the Jim Crow era over time. And according to the Reese decision, the 15th Amendment did not guarantee a citizen's right to vote. It just listed certain impermissible grounds to deny suffrage. So therefore, a path was open for southern states to disenfranchise blacks, supposedly for non-racial reasons. So they could do things like test people on their literacy. They could tax people before they would go to vote. And so all these things are technically unconstitutional, but the Reese case backed that up anyway. U.S. versus Cruikshank in 1876. Louisiana white supremacists were they were accused of attacking a meeting of blacks and were convicted under the Enforcement Acts, the KKK Acts. And this goes to the Supreme Court, and the court holds that the 14th Amendment extended the federal power to protect civil rights only in cases involving discrimination by states. So what that means is that discrimination by individuals or groups was not covered by the Constitution. So in other words, in some ways, this Cruikshank case protected white supremacy. Then the last are the series of civil rights cases in 1883. So in these cases, the court declared the 1875 Civil Rights Act that we just talked about. I'm going back for a second, I can't help myself. Here we are, that one. What that did was it explicitly declared that act unconstitutional. And that means the court held that the 14th Amendment gave Congress the power to outlaw discriminations by the state, but not by private individuals. So black people now must no longer be the special favorites of the law. That was the explicit language of the court, right? So it's sort of arguing, at least in the court's opinion, that African Americans were given too many privileges, and therefore the court was going to sort of relegate them back. So therefore, what these court cases, in a lot of ways, this marks the end of the federal government attempting to protect African Americans, and this continues well into the 20th century. So even though technically Reconstruction doesn't end until the next presidential election, at least in the history books it doesn't, in some ways we could say that the Supreme Court was well on its way to undermining Reconstruction. I lied. I said this was the last video, but let's take a break here and do one more. Stay tuned, and thanks.